Okay, Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. We were learning yesterday about a shvus. A shvus is a rabbinic prohibition, and the Mishnah had told us that there really is no difference between Shabbos and Yantiv. When Chazal instituted a prohibition, they were equal in their prohibition for both Shabbos and Yantiv. But the Mishnah had divided the category of shvus into three different subcategories. One it called shvus, the other one it called rishus, and the third one it called mitzvah. And as we had explained, it's really, they're all prohibited acts, but a shvus is a prohibited act where there's no mitzvah aspect to that act. Rishus is that there's a slight mitzvah aspect, and despite its slight mitzvahness, Chazal still forbade it because of a shvus. And the third is called mitzvah, which is also a shvus. But even though there's a mitzvah being performed in the course of that isser, Chazal nevertheless said don't do it. So we covered the first two categories. An example of shvus is climbing a tree on Shabbos. An example of rishus is getting married when you already have a wife and children. And what are examples of mitzvah? So that's what we're up to today, the fourth line. Ve'elu ein mishum mitzvah, lo makdishin v'lo marichin v'lo machrimin. You're not allowed to dedicate temple gifts. And the question is, why not? So the Gemara says, Gzeira mishum mekach u'memkar, because you're not allowed to engage in business activity. So Rashi tells us two explanations. There's a certain irony here, because up until now we've been learning that it's permissible to go ahead and make yontif purchases. You can go over to the butcher and ask him for a piece of meat. You're allowed to engage in that kind of exchange on yontif because of the mitzvah simchas yontif. But anything outside of that, Chazal did not permit you to do. Either because of the pasuk in Yeshaya, which says, that you're just not supposed to engage in weekday mercantile activity. And the other reason is because, like Rashi says, whenever you engage in business activity, you may come to write something down on your notebook or something like that, or on your iPad, whatever.
But we sell aliyahs.
But we sell aliyahs. Yes, we do. Right? That's some people say they don't say the dollar amount. They just say like a right. They say, but I'm saying even when they say the dollar amount, they don't say the word dollar.
And they mark it, with the cards.
What?
Card, pledge card, say don't have dollars.
Well, dollar's not as worth as much as it used to be. Anyway, so that's the reason why you're not supposed to make something hektish, is because of mekach umemkar issues, of mercantile issues. V'lo magbi'in trumas u'maisros, you're not allowed to tithe on yontif. Now this is something that the Mishnah asks as pshita because we've seen this so many times before. So the Gemara answers, Tani Rav Yosef lo nitzrach ela litna l'kayin boi bayom. That the chiddush is that what if, at the moment when I'm taking truma, I take it directly over to the kohen. So there, it doesn't have the appearance necessarily of my why you're not allowed to take trumas and maisos? Because of tikkun. You're not allowed to fix things, rectify things on Yantif or Shabbos. But here, it doesn't look like I'm rectifying my produce. It looks like I want to give a matana to the kohen for simchas yantiv. So you could have made a case to say that that issue of simchas yantiv overrides any concerns about tikkun, about rectifying your produce. And the chiddush is that no, even when you're giving it directly to the kohen, it's still going to be aser. But v'hani mili peri de tevili me esmo. Aval peri de tevili ha'idna. He says, but that's only true if the produce was tevel from before Yantif, it was untithed. And therefore you could have tithed it before Yantif, and therefore we don't give you the option of tithing it on Yantif. But if it only became tithable on Yantif, what's an example? Kagon Isa, la'afrushe mina chala, mefarshinan v'avinan l'kayin. Then, for example, dough. Dough is not tithable until you make it into dough. You don't make it into dough until you're ready to bake it. And therefore you're allowed to make dough on Yantif so that you can have fresh bread. Since you can't tithe it until it's dough, and you only make it dough on Yantif, you're allowed to tithe it and then immediately give it to the Kohen to minimize the appearance of tikkun and that it looks more like simchas Yantif for the Kohen. Vahani, so now, okay, fine. So frak the Gemara, v'hani mishum rishus ika mishum shavus leka, v'hani mishum mitzvah ika mishum shavus leka. The Gemara is asking a question on the verbiage of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that there are three categories of Isser: Shvus, Rishus, and Mitzvah. It doesn't really, verbally, that doesn't make much sense. Because what? Something that has a mitzvah component to it is not an Isser Shvus. The word Shvus means that you can't do it. The rabbi said that you have to rest, you have to desist from that act. So Rishus and Mitzvah are not a Shvus? Of course they're a Shvus. So why is it called a Rishus and a Mitzvah? Just call everything a Shvus. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak lo mibaya ka'amar. The answer is the Mishnah is telling you a Chiddush. Lo mibaya shvus greitza de aser, ela afilu shvus de rishus nami aser. V'lo mibaya shvus de rishus de aser, ela afilu shvus de mitzvah nami aser. The Gemara says you're right. Really, what the Mishnah really should call each category is shvus. There's a regular shvus, there's a rishus shvus, and there's a mitzvah shvus. They're all shavuses. Shavuses. I don't even know how to say shavutot. I'm not sure exactly how I would say it in the plural. But the point is that it wants to tell you that you might have thought that because there's a mitzvah aspect to certain activities, the shavus should be suspended and should be permitted for you to do that. Kamash Malan. That's why the Mishnah divides it up into three categories. They're really all shavus. But it's telling you that even when there's a mitzvah being performed, you're still not allowed to do it. So, okay, let's go on to the last part of the Mishnah, which is Kol Elu B'Yom Tov Amru Kal V'Chomer B'Shabbos and Ein Ben Yom Tov L'Shabbos Elo Ochel Nefesh Bilvad. That all of these rabbinic prohibitions apply equally to Shabbos and Yom Tov, and the only difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is that certain malachas of Ochel Nefesh are permitted on Yom Tov, which are not on Shabbos. But all other prohibitions, including rabbinic prohibitions, there's absolute equality between the two. So, Uraminu, let's raise a contradiction from the very last Mishnah. It said, Meshilin derech aruba b'yom tov avalo b'Shabbos. The Mishnah had said explicitly that you're allowed to lower your drying grain from the roof into your aruba, into your skylight, in order to preserve the produce. But it's only permitted to do that on Yom Tov. It's not permitted to do that on Shabbos. So you clearly see this is a rabbinic issue. It's an issue of muktzeh. It's an issue of something that's not usable on Yom Tov, and the rabbis normally would forbid you to exert yourself and to handle something that is not usable for Yom Tov, but because you want to save your investment, we give you a special dispensation to save the grain and prevent it from getting spoiled by the rain. But the Mishnah said that that's only a dispensation on Yom Tov. It's not a dispensation on Shabbos. So right off the bat, you see that there is a difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov having nothing to do with Ochel Nefesh, having nothing to do with food issues of doing malacha for food. This is all a rabbinic. We're more machmir even on the Isser D'Rabbanans on Shabbos than we are on Yom Tov. So how do you reconcile that? Amar Rav Yosef lo kasha ha Rabbi Eliezer ha Rabbi Yoshua. It's a machlokes tanoim between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. The Tanya oso v'espeno shenaflu labor. So I will illustrate it. You have a brisa that says, and we've seen this before, that if you have two animals that fall into a bore, the only problem is that one of them is not usable. Why is that? Because it's a mother and her baby calf. And it's on Yom Tov, and you're allowed to slaughter one of the two. The Torah says, you can't slaughter both of them on the same day. So you're only allowed to handle one animal. So therefore, what do? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Males Arishon Al Manas L'Shochto B'Shochto B'Asheni Oselo Parnasa B'Makamo Kadesh Shelo Yamas. So Rabbi Eliezer says you have to take out one animal, whichever one you want, take that one out, and the other animal is muktzah for you. You can't do anything with it. The only thing that you can do is you can stay by the pit for the rest of Yom Tov and feed the animal manually, because otherwise the animal will die in the pit. So that we allow you to do. We allow you to feed it. But anything other than that, you can't pull it out of the pit because it's muktzah. And Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Malis Arishon Al Manas L'Shochto Ve'eno Shochto V'chozer Marmu Mala Hasheni Ratzizeh Shaychet Ratzizeh Shaychet. And Rabbi Yeshua disagrees. Rabbi Yeshua says you pull out the first animal and you do a form of deceit. You do a form of deception, because really what you're doing is that you say to yourself, look, I'm not going to decide which animal I want to eat. You pull out the first one and say, not bad. I'm not sure if I want this one. Let me look at the other one. And then you pull out the other one, and then you get to decide which one you want to eat. So it's a form of deception, because you say, I think maybe I'll shech this one, but then I can change my mind. I think I'll shech this one, and then you can change your mind and pull out the other one and say, no, maybe I'll shech this one. So therefore, explains Rabbi Yoshua, you have a heter, a way of pulling out both animals. So the Gemara wants to make the following analogy. The Gemara says, you see that according to Rabbi Yehoshua, in order to help you save your financial loss, we allow you to do something liberal, to do something lenient in order to save both animals. That's the Mishnah of the first Mishnah of the parak, which talked about throwing the grain into the skylight. We allow you, for the sake of saving yourself from financial loss, we'll give you a special heter to save your grain. So too, Rabbi Yeshua gives you a special heter to save both animals. So you see that he's more makel when it comes to Yantif, on Yantif, than he is on Shabbos when there's a hefsid involved, when there's a financial loss involved. But Rabbi Eliezer does not hold of such a heter. When it comes to the animals, you pull out one and that's it. You don't have a heter to save the other animal. And similarly, he would disagree with the first Mishnah. He would say that it's both usher on Yantif and on Shabbos to put the grain through the skylight. And therefore, this Mishnah, which says that there is no difference between Shabbos and Yantif, goes like Rabbi Eliezer. The Mishnah, which says that there's a difference between Shabbos and Yantif, goes like Rabbi Yoshua. So the Gemara says, Amar le Abaya mimai. Abaya says, you're comparing apples and oranges. Dilma adkan lo kama Rabbi Eliezer hasam ela de efsher beparnasa. Aval hacha de efsher beparnasa lo. Maybe the only reason why Rabbi Eliezer is machmir over there is because you can save both animals' lives. It's just a bit more inconvenient that you have to stay by the pit for the rest of Yantif. Whereas over here, if you don't do something to get your grain into the skylight, you'll totally lose your investment. So maybe Rabbi Eliezer would be makel in our Mishnah. You have no raya from there. Inami akan lo kamer Rabbi Yoshua hasam ala de'efshar li'arume. Aval hacha de lo efshar li'arume lo. Alternatively, maybe Rabbi Yoshua only gives you a heter to pull out both animals because you can do that kind of deceitful act of deception and say, maybe I'll shech this one or maybe I'll shech that one, where it's not so overt that you're pulling out both animals for the sake of saving your money and not doing it for Yantif. Whereas over here in the Mishnah by the grain, there is no deception possible. It's self-evident that when you throw the drying grain into the skylight, you're not doing it for Yantif. So who says that Rabbi Yoshua would allow you to do that at all? So you see that the cases are not comparable at all. Ella Amar Rav Papa Lo Kasha Habe Shammai Habe Sila. So the final answer that the Gemara gives is that you're right, it is a machlokas tanoim, but not between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, but rather between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. D'nan Beis Shammai omrim ein motziin lo asakatan v'lo asalula v'lo asefer Torah lo reshus harabim u'Beis Hillel matirim. So it's the famous machlokas we've seen. Beis Hillel hold of the principle of mitoch, that once the Torah allows you to carry on Yantif for food, it allows you to carry all items, even non-food items, and Beis Shammai disagree. So therefore, when we look at the case of the first Mishnah with the grain, basically we're comparing carrying on Yantif to handling muktzah. Just like Beis Hillel is lenient and they allow you to carry anything, they'll also be liberal with the laws of muktzah and allow you to handle things that are not food issues, but rather you just need to handle them to protect yourself from loss. Whereas Beis Shammai, who are more stringent when it comes to carrying, and they tell you can only carry things that are food-related, will also be machmer when it comes to laws of muktzah, of tiltul, and they'll tell you that if something is not usable on Yantif, you have no heter to handle it. So therefore, the first Mishnah is like Beis Hillel, and our Mishnah over here that says that there's no difference except for Ochel Nefesh goes like Beis Shammai, which is a little bit startling because normally a Stam Mishnah we would not attribute it to Beis Shammai. But the Gemara had known this for some time. I just want to let you know that we had seen this Gemara already. The Gemara had said very clearly that this statement of Ein Bein Shabbos Liyom Tov V'lo Ichel Nefesh Bilvad is only a statement according to Beis Shammai. But the Gemara that says Dil Malohi Ad Kan Lo Kamri Beis Shammai Hasam Ela Ahotza Avolatil Tulo. So the Gemara says maybe you're still comparing apples and oranges. One, the discussion between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel has to do with what you're allowed to and what you're not allowed to carry. They never talked about what you're allowed to handle as far as muktzah on Shabbos. So who's to say that the two things are comparable? So the Gemara says, Atu tiltulav tzarech hotza'ahu? ? So the Gemara answers, well, let's think about it for a second. Why did the rabbis institute the laws of muktzah in the first place? One of the primary reasons was to prevent you from carrying those things that you're not allowed to carry outside and do a malacha with them. That's why they instituted the principle of muktzah in the first place. So if that's the case, then it stands to reason that whoever is more liberal with the laws of carrying on Yontif is also going to be more liberal with the laws of tiltul, of handling muktzah on Yontif. And vice versa, if you're more machmir with what you can carry on Yontif, you're going to be more machmir with muktzah and what you're allowed to handle. So therefore, we're going to stick with that. Beis Hillel is the author of the grain Mishnah, the first Mishnah, and Beis Shammai is the author of this Mishnah that says that Ochel Nefesh is the only thing that divides Shabbos and Yontif. But according to Beis Hillel, there are more, even certain rabbinic prohibitions like muktzah, there are differences between Shabbos and Yontif.
So this Mishnah by Beis Hillel, does that mean only a hefsek maruba, or what was the level of hefsek that was possible with that grain?
The Mishnah hadn't qualified it. If you recall, there were a lot of tekus in yesterday's Gemara precisely because it was not carefully quantified. Right?
The whole day of muktzah is because of Raizel? Is that what we're saying here now?
We're not saying. Well, the Gemara is saying that that's one of the primary reasons. I was careful to make sure that I phrased it in that way. You look at the Rishonim, you look at the Rambam, and you see that there are other reasons for tiltul as well, the Yisr tiltul or the Yisr muktzah. But one of the primary reasons has to do with preventing a person from carrying outside that which to be over on the Yisr of Hotzah. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ha-behema v'ha-kelim kiragle ha-ba'olim. So this Mishnah is switching gears and is talking about the laws of tchumen. If you recall, we had said that the law of tchum, even though you're allowed to carry on Shabbos, but you're limited as far as how much you're allowed to actually walk on Shabbos, which is a totally different halacha, and it has to do with how far outside of your domain are you allowed to travel. We know that you have 2,000 amos in all directions, and that halacha applies equally on Shabbos and on Yontif. And what the Mishnah is telling me is that when it comes to non-humans, either inanimate objects, kalim, or animals, which are the ownership of a human being, then those objects have the same limitations of tchum as their owner. So if the owner of a certain jug made an erev tchumen to the north, so that jug is allowed to go as far as the owner is allowed to go to the north. But it's also limited that it's just when you make an erev tchumen to extend your tchum to the north 2,000 amos, you also subtract 2,000 amos from the south. So just like the jug can go where the owner goes and go an additional 2,000 amos because he made an erev tchumen in the north, you have to subtract from that jug the ability to travel to the south. So we'll see some illustrations of this. Hamoser behemto livino o leroeh, hare elu kiragle ha'olam. If on Yontif you give over your animal to your son or to a shepherd for them to watch, then the shepherd has to know where your tchum is, because the animal is restricted by your tchum, not by the shepherd's tchum. So let's say I, as the owner of the animal, made an erev tchumen to the north, and the shepherd didn't make an erev tchumen, and he wants to travel to the south. Ain't gonna work, right? Because the animal is limited by my tchum, not by the shepherd's tchum. Kelim hamiyuchadim le'echad min ha'achem shebabayis, hare elu kiraglav, v'she'ein miyuchadim hare elu kemakom sheholachin. Next halacha is that let's say you have a group of brothers who are living in their deceased father's estate, and so they share all of the assets of the estate. So then, when you look at one particular kli in the house, a jug, right? So it depends. If one brother has dibs on that jug, right? So it's the jug that is in his bedroom that only he uses. So then the jug goes according to his tchum. But if the jug is shared equally by all the brothers and no one has dibs on that jug, so then that jug is limited by all of the limitations of all the brothers. So if one brother made an erev tchumen in the north, and another brother made an erev tchumen in the south, and a third brother didn't make an erev tchumen at all, so then you're limited to go. You can't go further north than the tchum of the guy who made the erev tchumen in the south. You can't go further north than the. You can't go further south than the tchum that the guy made in the north made. So you're going to be sort of sandwiched in between all of the different tchumen of all of the brothers. So, okay. So Hashol Kli Mechaver Me'erev Yom Tov Keragle Hashoel B'Yom Tov Keragle Hamashil. Now, if you borrow a kli from somebody else, it depends when you borrow it, because what establishes the tchum of an object, what its ownership is at the inception of Yantif. So, if you borrow the kli from the owner before Yantif, so then it's in your rishus when Yantif comes in, and therefore it goes according to your tchum. But if you borrow it on Yantif, like giving it over to the shepherd on Yantif, so then it always retains its status of the owner's tchum. And v'chein ha'isha sheshala mechaver tatavlu n'mayim u'melech li'isasa harei elu kiraglei shteihen. Now, the next case is that if you have a woman who wants to make bread, and she's borrowing from her friend spice and water and salt in order to make dough, so then if the woman making the dough has one tchum and her friend has another tchum, the bread is going to be sandwiched in between those two tchumen because it's got ingredients from both tchumen. Rabbi Yehuda poter b'mayim mipnei she'ein bohen mamish. But Rabbi Yehuda says water is different. If the water has a different tchum from all of the other ingredients, you ignore the water, because in the finished product you can't see the water, you can't detect it, and therefore it doesn't limit the challah, or the dough, as far as where it can travel. Let's go on to the Gemara. The Gemara says, Masnisin deloka Rebbe Dosa. It seems like our Mishnah is not like Rebbe Dosa. The Tanya Rebbe Dosa Omer, V'amri la Abashol Omer, Halokeach behema mechaveru me'erev Yom Tov, Afal pishalo masralo, ela b'Yom Tov, Ariu karagle halokeach. So case number one is pretty straightforward. It hasn't been discussed in our Mishnah, but it's pretty clear that if you make a kinyan to purchase an animal, and that kinyan is made before Yantif, even though you haven't yet taken formal delivery of that animal is yours. So therefore, even if you don't take delivery until Yantif itself, the animal goes according to your tchum, since you are the official owner. You're the title holder of that animal from before Yantif. Next, v'hamoser behema l'roeh, afal pishalo masralo ela b'yom tov, harehu karagle haroeh. But here's the part that's controversial. It says, according to Rebbe Dosa, that if you give an animal to a shepherd, even if you give it to him on Yantif, the animal goes according to the shepherd's tchum, not according to the owner's tchum. Our Mishnah had said just the opposite, that if you give it to him on Yantif, it goes according to the owner's tchum. So the Gemara answers, Afilu tema Rebbe Dosa v'lo kasha, kan baroa echad, kan bishnei roim. So the answer is no, it's not a contradiction, because our Mishnah is talking about where there's more than one shepherd in the community. And therefore, it's not anticipated automatically that you're going to be giving the animal to that particular shepherd. And since it's not clear, it's not indicated who you're going to leave your animal with, you may end up holding it for the whole Yantif. You may give it to shepherd A, you may give it to shepherd B, and therefore, it retains the status of the tchum of the owner, since no one knows where it's headed. But in a situation where there's only one shepherd in the community, and typically everyone gives their animal to that shepherd during the daytime so that they can go to shul, right, or for whatever reason, so then it becomes pretty self-evident that that animal is going to be in the shepherd's possession on Yantif, and therefore even before Yantif it's as if it's designated for the shepherd. And that's the difference between Reb Dosa and our Mishnah. They're not arguing with each other. Dikanami dekatani livno o l'roesh mamina. And that's actually clear in the language of our Mishnah, because the Mishnah says you can give it either to your son or to the shepherd, which means you have options in our Mishnah. And because you have options, and it's unknown what option you're going to opt for, so therefore the animal retains the tchum of the owner. But in Rebbe Dosa's case, there are no options. You're typically going to only give it to that shepherd, and therefore it assumes that shepherd's tchum. Amar Rabbi Bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha keRebbe Dosa. He says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that we paskin like Rebbe Dosa, that the animal assumes the tchum of the shepherd. Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan hachiv, Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam mishnah utznan behema ve'akelim karaglei haba'olim. How can you tell me that Rabbi Yochanan paskins like Rebbe Dosa? After all, our Mishnah says that it assumes the tchum of the owner, and we know that Rabbi Yochanan always paskins like a stam mishnah, like an anonymous mishnah. So the Gemara says, but what kind of question is that? We just addressed that. V'lavu kimna kan baroa echad kan b'shnei roim. We explained it's not a stira. You can paskin like our Mishnah and say that when there's more than one option for leaving your animal with a shepherd, so then it retains the status of the owner's tchum. And when there's only one option, which is what Rebbe Dosa was talking about, then it goes to the shepherd's tchum. Fine. Tanu Rabbanan. Shnaim sheshalu chalok echad b'shutvus. Zed leilech bo shachris lebeis hamedrash v'zeli konis bo arvis lebeis hamishta. You have two guys, Reuven and Shimon, who decide, you know what, we're going to rent a tux. Let's rent a tux for Yantif. And Reuven is the studious one, and he says, okay, I'm going to wear the tux to the Beis Medrash and learn Torah in the Beis Medrash Yantif morning. And Shimon likes to party, and he says, I'm going to wear the tux in the afternoon. I'm going to have a wild party. The problem is that the Beis Medrash is up in the north of our Tchum, and the the Mishta, the Beis HaMishta, the party house, is down south of our Tchum. So Ze Arav Alav Litzafon, V'Ze Arav Alav Lidarim. So Reuven makes his Erev Tchumen in the north. Shimon makes his Erev Tchumen in the south to get to the party house. So Zeh Sha'arav Alav Litzafon, Mahalach Litzafon, Karag Lemisha Arav Alav Lidarim. V'Zeh Sha'arav Alav Lidarim, Mahalach Lidarim, Karag Lemisha Arav Alav Bitzafon. So here's the problem. The problem is that they want to use the same tux. And that tux is limited by the common space between those two tchumen. So if, let's say, Reuven extended his boundaries by 1,000 amas to the north, that means he subtracts 1,000 amas from his ability to go to the south. And the same thing vice versa with Shimon, which now means that Reuven can only go 1,000 amas to the north, and Shimon can only go 1,000 amas to the south, even though by making their Erev Tchumen, they had planned to go 3,000 in the north for Reuven and 3,000 in the south for Shimon. But they're stuck because they want to wear the same tux. Of course, if they wear different clothing, they can go according to their Erev Tchumen, but they can't wear the tux to where they want to go because they jointly own it. V'matzu es hatchum, Raizel lo yizizena mimakoma. And not only that, but if you want to take it to the extreme, if Reuven extends to the north to the maximum degree, which is an additional 2,000 amas, he goes to the 2,000 amma point, he puts down an Erev Tchumen there and extends it another 2,000 to get a total of 4,000. But that means you have to subtract 2,000 from the south. See, he's got 0 in the south. Shimon does the same thing in the south, so he's got 0 in the north. In that scenario, they can't move that tux an inch north or an inch south. They're stuck. They got to stay where they are.
At 2 o'clock, I say it's mafker.
What?
Menachem, I say at 2 o'clock on Shabbos, it's a mafker, the item.
I don't think you can mafkir something in advance. I don't think you can do that.
At 2 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to say
You're making a declaration of hefker? It's ownerless?
I don't have a problem.
Maybe that would be a solution. First of all, are you allowed to be mafkir something on Yontif? That's an interesting question. I'm doing
Ben Shmashas. I'm doing an event.
No. You can't make a hefker. You can't make something hefker in advance. As soon as you use it for personal use, you're taking possession of it. Hefker is not something that can be.
I can't make it tonight that this thing will become hefker.
No. It's either hefker or it's owned by you. As soon as you pick it up, it becomes yours again.
Oh.
Okay, but it's an interesting question. Would you be able to be mafkir it if, let's say, they're both mafkir it after the fact?
After the use.
Right, but
the guy takes it north, and then after he's finished with it, he's mafkir it.
He's mafkir it.
He loses it, and then the guy.
I don't know whether you can. It could be there's a problem of being mafkir something on Yom.
Can he have to make a kinyan on it when he picks it up? Is he making a kinyan on it? The second guy. The guy mafkired it. The first guy mafkired. The second guy comes and picks it up. Now he's making a kinyan.
I think that an inanimate object acquires the tchumen of whatever it was ben hashmashas. So therefore, even if it were made hefker, it wouldn't lose that status of being confined by that tchum. I don't think that's going to help. Itmar. So let's take a look at the next statement. Shnaim shalakhu chabesu behema b'shutfus. 2 people acquire either a barrel of wine or an animal before Yantif so that they can use it on Yantif. Rav amar chabes muterasu behema asura. Ushmuel amar chabes nami asura. So Rav, here we're talking about tchumen again. Because Reuven and Shimon, what Reuven wants to do is he wants to take his wine all the way up north. Shimon wants to take his wine all the way down south. And Reuven makes an Erev Tchumen in the north. Shimon makes an Erev Tchumen in the south. The problem is that they're precluded because of the wine. The wine is jointly owned. So Rav says the wine is okay. But if they shech the animal and then they want to split it in half, and Reuven wants to take his half to the north, and Shimon wants to take his half to the south, that's not okay. And Shmuel says both the wine and the behema are going to be usher. So now we have to understand what Rav is holding. Why does he make a distinction between the wine and the animal? My kasavar Rav. I kasavar yesh breira afilu behema tishtari, vi kasavar ein breira afilu chavis nami asura. So the only thing that we can think of is the concept of breira, which basically means is that if you have 10 liters of wine, and Reuven takes 5 liters and Shimon takes 5 liters, and you hold of breira, so then it turns out that at the inception of Yantif, when they first took possession of the wine, the 5 liters that Reuven eventually got were already designated retroactively to him, and the 5 liters that Shimon ends up getting were retroactively his all along. And so therefore, when they made the Erev Tchumen, so their wine, it's not that the wine was stuck between the two of them. Reuven's 5 liters went according to him, and Shimon's 5 liters went according to him, because retroactively, however they divide it, was always theirs retroactively. Okay, it's not like they're dividing it up now. It's looked at as retroactively. That's what breira means, retroactivity. It's retroactively divided from before Yantif. That makes sense, but then the question is, then why don't you say the same thing by the animal? Right, that's the question. Okay? And if he doesn't hold of breira, v'iksaver ein breira, afilu chavis nami asura, and if there's no breira, then of course both the animal and the wine should be asur. So the Gemara says, la'olam, and that would be what Shmuel holds. So the Gemara says, la'olam kisaver yesh breira, v'shanya behebet kayanchi tchumen mehadadi. A brilliant analysis. The Gemara is basically telling me that Rav does hold of breira. When it comes to something that's inanimate, you can say 5 liters that you take were always yours retroactively, and the same thing with yours. But when you're dealing with a live animal, you can't. It's completely one cohesive unit. It's an organism. You can't say that retroactively the half that you take was always yours, because that half that you've taken when it was part of a living organism was sustaining itself from the other half. In other words, it depended on its very existence for the other half to have the blood flowing and the tissues and the nerves and everything was interconnected. So there's no way to say that retroactively your half is your half and my half was my half even when it was alive. You can only say that the animal is divided in half once it's shechted, and it's not dependent upon all of the other parts of the organism for its existence.
Why can't you make that argument with the liquid? Because it's not that they're sustaining each other, but you can't differentiate that 5 from
That's the difference, because one is an issue of sustenance. It can't sustain itself. It's not sustainable without the other half, but with liquid it is sustainable. It's just that it's mixed. So you can say that you're separating that which had already been retroactively separated, but is just mixed together. So now the Gemara says, Amri le Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'Rav le'isra muksa lo chashashu le'isra tchumen chashashu. So they're asking him a question. So Rav, if you hold of breira, but you're telling me that you don't say breira with a living organism, I have a problem. So fine, you've resolved why there's a problem with tchumen of transporting Reuven's portion beyond where Shimon's tchum is and vice versa. But what about the issue of muktzah? If Reuven, when he has his mind on his half of the animal, he's precluding it from Shimon's usability, and Shimon is doing the same. But if the animal, while it's alive, is all intertwined, they consider it to be one organism, so then there should be like mutual destruction. There should be mutual muktza'ing of each other guy's half, because Shimon's half is intermingled with Reuven's, and Reuven had precluded Shimon from using his animal. Shimon had precluded Reuven from using his half of the animal. And so therefore, by the time I get my half is intermingled with flesh that had been precluded from my use, and so therefore there should be a problem of muktzah. That's the conceptual challenge that they present to Rav. Once you posit that a living organism is not separable conceptually, so then this animal should be mutually muktzahized, right? And therefore no one should be able to even handle it on Yantif. So the Gemara answers, so it says Shasik Rav. Rav didn't have a response. Doesn't mean that there isn't a response, it just means that at this juncture Rav did not have an answer. My Havi Alasa, what was the upshot of this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel? Rabbi Hoshia Amar Yesh Breira, Rabbi Yechanan Amar Ein Breira. Rabbi Hoshia says we do say breira, and therefore the wine is okay, and it's not limited by the other partner's tchum. And Rabbi Yechanan says there's no breira, and therefore you're limited. You can't transport the wine north or south. You got to keep it in their common space. So the Gemara now says, "V'saber Rabbi Hoshia yesh breira." Since when does Rabbi Hoshia hold of breira? V'hatznan hames b'bayis v'lo pisachim harbe kulam tumeim. Now we had seen this a few weeks ago. This very famous Mishnah, which is which is a Tosefta actually. It says as follows. It says that if a person is if there's a corpse in the house, and there are multiple doors to get the corpse out of the house, so then each doorway, if you remember we learned about this, the doorway itself is not part of the ohel where the corpse is, but if there are kalim within that door frame, then all of the kalim become tameh because of this principle of sof tumah latzes, that if the tumah, the corpse, will eventually be traversing that doorway, then we consider the tumah in that doorway right now. And therefore, even though there's no tumah right now in the doorway, but all of the kalim in that doorway are tameh based on the future transportation of the mace through that door. And even though there are multiple doorways, since we don't know which doorway the mace is going to go through, we look at all of the doorways as being equally tameh. But niftach echad mehen hu tameh v'kulan torim. But that's only if all things are equal. But if only one door is open and the other doors are sealed or closed, so then only the open door is considered to be the door which the mace is destined to pass through, and only the kalim in that doorway are going to be tameh, but all of the other doorways do not have tumah. Chashav lahotzio be'echad meheno b'chalon sheish bo arba al arba matzeles al hapsachim kulan. And the next thing that the Brisa says is that if a person mentally designated that I'm going to use the north door to get the corpse out of the house, then all of the other doorways no longer have tumah, and therefore the kalim that are in those doorways are not tameh. But Beis Shammai Omrim, he qualifies it and he says, "V'hu shechashav alav ad shelo yamus hameis." That's only provided that you made that mental designation before the corpse died. But if you made the designation after the person died, so then it's already too late. And Beis Hillel Omrim af mishayamus hameis, and Beis Hillel says no. You can even make that designation after the corpse is already in the house. And as long as you make that designation even after the fact, you can save the tumah from being present in the other doorways. But the problem is, ve'itmar Allah, Amar Rabbi Hoshia, l'tayres ha'pesachim mikanu lahaba in lamafreya lo. But Rabbi Hoshia had qualified Beis Hillel's statement and said, that's only true that Beis Hillel say that you can make the mental designation even post-mortem. That's only to save future kalim, which means that he doesn't hold of breira. Because Rabbi Hoshia says you're only allowed to save the kalim that are introduced to those doorways after your designation. In other words, I say at 10 o'clock this morning that I'm going to transport the corpse out of the northern door. So that means that kalim that are brought in at 11 o'clock into the southern door will not become tameh. But if there were kalim in the southern door at 9 a.m., so then those kalim will be tameh, because we don't say retroactively my designation works to save the tumah from the other doorway. So you see very clearly that Reb Hoshia doesn't hold of breira, doesn't hold of retroactivity. How can you tell me therefore that Reb Hoshia holds of breira over here? So the Gemara says, Eipoch, Rabbi Hoshia Amar Ein Breira, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yesh Breira. So the Gemara says, you're right. Switch around what I just said previously, and it's Rabbi Hoshia who doesn't hold of Breira, and therefore the wine is limited by both partners and is limited to that common space between the two of them. And Rabbi Yochanan says, we hold of Breira, and therefore Reuven can take his wine to where he wants to go, and Shimon can take his wine where he wants to go. But now the Gemara says, well, yeah, now you have another question. Mi isleila Rabbi Yochanan Breira. Since when does Rabbi Yochanan hold of breira? V'ha'amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, ha'achin shechalku l'kuchos, ha'achin shechalku l'kuchos hein, u'machzirin zelo ze b'yovel. That Rabbi Yochanan had said explicitly that if two brothers inherit from their deceased father the estate, and they decide, you know what, we have this big field that we've inherited from Dad, let's split it. Reuven, you take the north part of the field, and Shimon will take the south part of the field. Deal. However, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's not the predestined lot that fell to Reuven at the time of death. You don't say that retroactively that's what Reuven inherited from the time of the father's death. No. At the time of death, we were equal owners in every square inch of the field. Reuven bartered his share in the south for all of the north, and Shimon bartered his share in the north for all of his shares in the south. And basically, the ramification is that at Yovel, since we view each other as having bartered with each other, anytime you buy something, a piece of real estate, it goes back at Yovel. And therefore, the ramification is that at Yovel, the field reverts back to being jointly owned by both of them instead of Reuben owning the north and Shimon owning the south. But what do you see from there? You see that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of retroactivity. Because if he held of retroactivity, that when Reuven and Shimon divide the field, then it would be retroactively mean that retroactively, whatever, at the moment of death, Reuven's share was the north and Shimon's share was the south, and there would be no reversion at Yovel. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of Breira. V'chi tema ki lesle Rabbi Yochanan Breira b'deraisa aval b'derabanan yislei. Maybe one possible solution is to suggest that Rabbi Yochanan really holds of the principle of Breira, but only with rabbinic law. With Torah law, like reverting property back to its original owner at Yovel, Rabbi Yochanan is not going to play games with retroactivity. But when it's only a matter of rabbinic law, such as Tchumen, for our argument's sake, we'll say that Tchumen is a rabbinic law for now. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan will permit Reuven to go as far north as he wants and Shimon to go as far south as he wants, because we're only dealing with rabbinic law, and there we could say Breira. Maybe that's the solution. But the Gemara says, "Uvidarabanan mi islay." But we're going to prove to you that even with rabbinic law, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of the principle of Breira, and that's what we'll commence with Amir Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful